Hello, welcome to WordCamp Santa Clarita 2020. I hope you didn't catch me doing some chair dancing to that previous intermission, but it was pretty good. My name is Sumner Davenport. I'm the lead organizer for this WordCamp. I have been creating websites for over 20 years, and due to personal experience, I've been dedicated to web accessibility for over 12. You are listening to the 11 a.m. talk with Taylor Arndt in the Sky Tower track. Please feel free to add your questions to the YouTube chat feed and we'll answer those at the end. If you preface your question with the word question, the moderators will be able to find them easier. Our next speaker, Taylor Arndt, started her company in the height of the pandemic after she was let go from her university job where she helped students with technical support. Being blind since birth, she understands the importance of accessibility for all, and she helps companies get online and become more inclusive. Since accessibility is more important than ever, what we know is that designers are thinking about the front end, what the user might see, and they're forgetting about the back end, the part that the client is going to be using. One way that you can ensure accessibility for all is making sure that your WordPress backend is also accessible. This ensures that all users are able to edit your website. Taylor's going to cover that in her presentation, the importance of WordPress backend accessibility. Here's Taylor.
Hello, WordCamp Santa Clarita. My name is Taylor Arndt, and today we're going to be talking about importance of making your WordPress backend accessible. Before I get into my slides, I have a couple housekeeping things I will go over. First off, if you would like to follow along, these slides are located at taylorstechtalks.com/slides. So taylorstechtalks.com/slides is where you are able to find this presentation if you would like to refer back to it later. With that out of the way, let's get started, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As stated earlier, we're going to be talking about the importance of making your backend WordPress websites accessible. Background about myself. So my name is Taylor Arndt. I've been in the accessibility field for the past 3 years now. I own my own company, Taylor's Accessibility Services, LLC, where I help companies become more inclusive and get online. Being blind since birth, I understand how important accessibility is for everyone, and I understand what is needed to try to make people more accessible. Introduction. You most likely understand that websites need to be accessible on the front end for your users to interact, but you may not think about how having an accessible backend can negatively affect users as well. And your backend could be where you have an employee edit your site if you are a company who depends on WordPress, for example, a township who has a blind employee that needs to edit their department. And this is actually something true that has happened to me, where the township came to me and was like, we want to make our website accessible. That's great. But we need to make sure that the back end's accessible because you never know if you're going to get somebody who's blind or has another disability, and the plugins that you guys choose to use on the back end will make their job impossible. So we want to think about that as well, not just for townships, but for everyone, because you never know who's going to be on the other side editing your sites. Or not even editing, but who has to interact with your sites as well. There are many benefits to making your backend accessible, and most of the time, people don't think about these. Why make your WordPress backend accessible? ensuring all parties are able to make changes to your website. So whether that's like an editor or, for example, let's say that you have tech support and they use a support ticket system based on WordPress and they may have a disability of some sort, they need to be able to make changes. Or even if you use some of those WordPress employee tracking plugins, for HR, and if you have everything through WordPress, or even as stated, like a CRM as well. So allowing people to edit the back end is very important to make sure that you are a fully inclusive company for all. Without accessibility, you may be locking future parties from editing your website, which could be very bad if you are hiring somebody to help you edit, or you are employing them to ensure that you are accessible if you're doing an audit later on. And let's just be frank, it's the right thing to do. Having an accessible backend is the right thing to do. It's just the right thing to do in this era is to make sure your front end and your back end are fully accessible for all. Considerations before your website is constructed. There are a few things that need to be done to ensure your backend is fully accessible. Have a good idea of the themes and plugins wanting to be used before you actually start. This will help to ensure that a good plan is mapped out so that you are able to ensure that those plugins are fully accessible. Research all theme and plugin options for potential accessibility barriers and to do a general accessibility audit before implementing them. And when you're doing this audit, make sure that they're fully accessible on the back end as well as the front end. So having that double-pronged accessibility approach will definitely be a useful area here. Another thing that can commonly trip people up is their developers. Ensure that the developers that you use have the same commitment to accessibility as you do. This will definitely go a long way to ensuring everyone is more accessible. Because if you work with developers who understand the importance of accessibility when developing your site, they can help you to be able to make sure that your site is fully accessible. Because a lot of developers these days don't know about accessibility, nor do they know about the backend accessibility. In fact, very few do. So having a developer, for example, who has a disability could actually be a good asset because they can be able to help you kind of with both. So that could be kind of a cool approach to take. And that's where somebody like myself could come in. Get an accessibility expert in the very early stages. This will ensure that your plugin and theme selections and your intended plan is going to work as expected. So an accessibility expert can kind of tell you what themes and plugins will work well and what ones won't. So for example, myself or somebody else who is very familiar with WordPress accessibility, we deal with plugins on a daily basis, and so we will have the expertise to be able to tell what plugins and what themes will help you to be able to make the most accessible site for what you're trying to achieve. There's also other ways of doing this as well. Definitely, like I said, reaching out to the plugin developer, the theme developer, if there are issues. But again, having that accessibility person on hand that can answer your questions will definitely serve you well. Choosing a theme for your needs. So we have talked a lot about the considerations before website construction, which is great. But now we're going to kind of talk about the theme selection and the plugin selection, because these are the next two areas where we have to really be careful about how we design our sites. So, for example, the theme that I use exclusively is called Generatepress. A lot of you all probably have heard of it. I like it because it's accessible on both the front and the back end. So it's very important that the theme that you choose is accessible on both ends. And it does produce very accessible output. And it's fully accessible for a blind developer or another developer with a disability to edit, like myself. So in my little agency / business thing, I exclusively use Generatepress because their commitment to accessibility and how accessible it is on the front end and the back end. The developer is very committed to accessibility for all. If there's an issue, he will fix it. So he is really awesome. Tom is really great. And I'd highly recommend giving Generatepress a try on your next project. There are many themes available. However, choosing one that meets the accessibility standards can be a very difficult task because there are so many themes to choose from. And just because a theme says that it is accessibility ready may not always be accessibility ready. So they test some themes, for example, on WordPress.org, and it says accessibility ready. But just because it's accessibility ready does not mean that it's fully accessible. So just keep that in mind. Always do your own independent audit and review to make sure that the theme you selected will be fully accessible on the front and back end. Okay, finally, diving deep into plugins. So this is where a lot of people get stuck. Plugins are kind of one of those death traps because they can be accessible on the back end or they can be completely inaccessible. WordPress is by default accessible. It's just what you do on the back end and the front end that can make it fully inaccessible, because WordPress, again, is accessible out of the box. It's just what is done that could make it inaccessible. So just keep that in mind, that by default, you always have an accessible WordPress site. It's just what you do to make it inaccessible can definitely have a very negative impact. And a lot of that has to do with your theme and your plugins. So let's dive deep into some plugins. Plugins are obviously an important component of any website. We already understand that, right? Because they help us with our functionality, they help extend functionality, they help add functionality. Without plugins, we don't have a website. That's just the truth of the matter. So we already get that we need plugins. That's fine. Choosing plugins can be extremely difficult. I understand, because there are so many available. In fact, I can argue that there can be too many plugins available sometimes. So trying to find ones that meet your needs is definitely one of those guessing games sometimes. What I would say is conduct reviews of all plugins that are intended for use and make sure the backend is fully accessible. And again, having somebody like myself or somebody else on your team during the website build process can definitely help with this step. If you're committed to accessibility, then making sure that you have somebody with a disability on the team, again, is going to be your best way to ensure that your website's fully accessible for all. So making sure that they can, do the screen reader audits, do the magnification, make sure it's accessible for low vision, make sure it has all the other WCAG component accessibility. That is definitely going to be the key to making sure you have an accessible site. If you're unsure of the accessibility, which you probably are in most instances, get them reviewed. Get them reviewed for accessibility. That is going to be the easiest way to ensure that you are fully accessible on the back end and the front end, is get your site reviewed and have an expert on hand during the build process. All right. This was how to 3, 2, 1. Alrighty. So this wraps up the presentation, and now I will open it up for some question and answers, and hopefully we can create more accessible backends. So with that, I hope to see you all later, and thank you for allowing me to present today.
So thank you so much, Taylor. That was very informative. And for a lot of people who had not considered the back end needing to be accessible, I think it kind of gave them a new perspective. So we do have a few questions. What is the most difficult WordPress admin task that you have encountered?
That's a really great question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, cool. Want to make sure my Wi-Fi is going to be holding up. This. So yeah, that's a really awesome point. And what I would say the most difficult admin task is when I have to deal with plugins that may not be accessible, right? Because every plugin again has its own accessibility or inaccessibility on the back end. And so in terms of admin tasks, there's been a few plugins, for example, where maybe if I'm doing server stuff, like I was doing this morning, a big server migration project, that was just pretty fun to do. Really not. But in terms of dealing with the server stuff, like the theme editor or the like plugin editor, not that I have to really go in there, but that can be kind of a little bit of an interesting thing because you can do it, right? But there's some accessibility challenges in terms of that. And then just, in random places, it's kind of one of those things, right? It's just like there's some random spots in WordPress that are just like, oh, this could be labeled a little bit better. But I would say if you're doing, some plugin maintenance tasks related to like a certain plugin, like changing settings, and the plugin isn't accessible, that's what I would say would be the most difficult part of that.
Good point. Have you ever had to edit a plugin that advertised itself as accessible?
Honestly, I really haven't per se. Again, I will edit plugins, but what I honestly try to do first, if I can avoid it, or like not edit the plugin, if I can, right? Because that takes time, right? And frankly, I'm not the best WordPress plugin developer there is out there. But more importantly, I can edit the plugin. But if I edit the plugin, it's just going to be for myself, which is fine. But think about how many other users are trying to use that plugin as well. So what I try to do is I actually try to go to the developer of that plugin because they can make the changes on a more global level. And that way it will ensure that it's more accessible in the back end for everyone, not just myself, right? Because I could be selfish. And yes, there are times where I may have to do that. But if I can, I try to go with the approach of the education first.
Great approach, because I think someone said in another talk, if we don't tell them there's a problem, they don't know there's a problem and are not motivated to look for it. So therefore it doesn't get fixed. So talking to the developer, very good point. Yeah. Taylor, if you could snap your finger and one issue would immediately go away to improve backend accessibility, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah, I know this question was asked similarly yesterday, I think, in the opening remarks. And man, this is a hard question because, right, there's so many little nitpicky things that, could get fixed. But if I had to say one thing, I know that Joel also answered this question, right? Yesterday, and that keynote thing was awesome. But what I would say is if I could fix one thing, it would be trying to educate WordPress developers on the importance of accessibility before they're developing their plugins, right? So these WordPress training courses for developers, they're great, but I'm not sure how many of them actually have plugin accessibility on the back end covered as one of the topics. And I think that is where we should start, right? I would, I want people to be able to admit that there's a problem with accessibility, right? But I also want them to be able to admit and to be able to fix issues before they even become issues by making the plugin accessible in the first place. And in order to do that, when they're learning how to make plugins, that accessibility guidelines and accessibility standards and whatnot, and not only accessibility, right, but usability, because there's a big difference there, right? Just because it's compliant does not always mean that it's usable. And so having that differences in the training and the documentation and the tutorials, I would say if I had to pick one problem, that's what it would be.
Great. Thank you. A lot of the WordPress websites these days are using page builders.
Oh,
so
man.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to open up this can of worms now, Sumner.
Oh, sure. So how do these popular page builders enable or make it more difficult for page content editing?
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, yeah, now we're getting into some deep stuff here. So, page builders. I know why people love them. I understand. and I'm sure that there are page builder fans in the audience, and I'm not going to say that they're bad, right? I mean, because, well, they kind of are bad on the back end for accessibility. They are actually really, really awful, because a lot of the times when my clients use page builders, I'm not able to actually edit their sites. Typically, what I do when I develop client sites is I use the native Gutenberg editor. And why do I do this? Well, for one thing, it's built into WordPress. That's the main reason. But not only that, for two, you get all the benefits built in, right? The speed and stuff, which I'm not going to really cover, in that right, because the question's about accessibility. But what I can say is that page builders make my life and anybody who is trying to remediate inaccessible websites who may use a screen reader on the back end makes our life very difficult. And this actually happened at one point where I wasn't really editing a site for accessibility, but I went to a WordPress meetup, and I was the lucky participant that got selected to help with this light speed thing. They were showing off a demo. And of course, the presenter had no idea that I was blind, right? Because I was just in the Zoom room and not, and then all of a sudden, I was the one that had to share my screen. And they were using Elementor on the back end. I'm like, uh-oh, this is not going to go well. Of course, and it's being recorded and streamed. And I'm like, uh-oh. And of course, this was my first time attending this meetup too. So I was like, that whole thing. But the point is, I was actually able to do it, right? But it's not that it's easy because, there's so many other things that we have to keep in mind too as well, right? There's a lot of, the blocks, right, that are not accessible. There is one exception. And I'd say exception in a very minor, way, right? So if you are using the Oxygen builder, which I know is very popular, a lot of people use it. If you have certain add-ons in the way that you can, do it, certain extensions, you are able to convert back and forth between Gutenberg. So if you absolutely must use a page builder, try out Oxygen. But honestly, if you could just not use a page builder, that would make my life and anybody else on the back end who has to deal with accessibility, that would make all of our lives easier just because of the inaccessible blocks and content that's created.
Good point. Lots of very good information. A question, since you love Generatepress, what are your thoughts on WordPress's newest release, 2021, as it's marketed as having the most accessible features in a template?
Yes, I have tried the full site editing and the WordPress themes and all of that stuff. And in terms of the 2021 theme, is that kind of what the question states?
Correct.
Okay. I think it's definitely great. It's definitely, gone, right? Gone up in accessibility, right? But obviously there are certain things, that I still like to use Generatepress for, but I think WordPress is definitely striving to make their stuff more accessible. And so I'm super happy. And also on the back end, in terms of the customizer and the controls, everything seems to be very accessible. So good job on that end. It seems every year they get better and better.
Nice to hear. Nice to hear. We know that you've identified yourself as a blind user.
Yep.
What do you find is the most common problem with a website for a blind user?
So on the back end or front end or both? Or
both, please.
All right. So let's start off with the front end, right? Because we want to start off with the user interaction, because that's where a lot of us blind users are going to be at. In terms of the people that are going to be editing websites, if you're blind, right? Especially if you're a developer, right? Because I'm not only a website, I'm not really typically a designer, but I'm a website accessibility, consultant, but I also have development skills, so I can actually program. And there's not going to be a lot of users that can actually have both skill sets. So what I would say, if we're going to start on the front end, the most common issues that I see, well, there's actually a few of them. Alt text for images and tables not being marked up properly, believe it or not, is definitely something. And I see this a lot with calendar plugins. Right. So if we're going to talk about calendar plugins, I really like that My Calendar plugin. And I sent out a tweet yesterday when that was presented. And I really love that plugin. And I use it on all my sites for calendars, because not only does it have, and again, this is kind of off topic, but it's something that has to be mentioned, right? Because we're talking about tables.
Absolutely.
Not only does it have accessibility on the front end, but it has accessibility on the back end. And the user, are really being listened to, right? So Joel, the developer, he's really listening to everybody and, the blindness community, right? There's a big site that was just launched with it called ACB Media, which is the American Council of the Blind's media network site. And they use my calendar exclusively because it's fully accessible and the commitment from the developers. So, and I bring tables up because, again, that's a very common tripping point. And there are a lot of plugins like for calendars, right? Like the events calendar and some of the other ones that are not the most accessible on either the front or the back end. And so, having those plugins are definitely, this is why we want to review things, right? But in terms of the front end, more issues, I guess, like I said, so tables, alt text, heading structure can be definitely a problem. A lot of times people will use paragraphs and they will accidentally put them in headings, right? So they think, oh, we're just going to bold all this. Just don't do that. I mean, that's just not going to be helpful. There's form labels that are missing. I mean, there's a ton of issues, right? But, those are some of the most common. In terms of the back end, though, we have a few issues in terms of unlabeled buttons in the back end, or most commonly what I see is in the plugin admin menu, I see link. And actually, I am going to be doing these live streams. So you saw me in this chat as Taylor's Tech Talks. And it wasn't really intentional that I logged in with my YouTuber profile, but I have something called speech chat on my other profile. Literally, speech chat will literally read out all the chat messages. And it was going so fast because normally when I stream that I couldn't hear the presenter. So I had to log into Taylor's Tech Talks so that I could get away from speech chat. But the point I'm saying here is I'm going to be actually reviewing plugins from the back end. And I just did the first stream and it was impromptu, but I actually reviewed the Jetpack plugin. And so I literally tear it down from the back end for accessibility. So, if you're ever like, oh, how accessible, how do you review a plugin from the back end? Well, just watch some of those streams. I'm going to be doing them a lot, right? I'm going to be doing Amber's plugin soon and a whole bunch of others. But the whole point is that, if you want to learn accessibility, and learn how to, review stuff, like I said, watching and definitely doing these resources. But those are what I'd say the most common issues are. Obviously there's, a lot more, but it also depends on the plugin itself too, right? So, there could be drop downs that aren't labeled, but those are what I would say are the most common issues.
And those are very common. I know.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard it from other people as well. Now, of course, since you have mentioned a calendar plugin that you like, people are asking, can you tell us what that calendar plugin is?
I can. And again, this is what I keep doing, right? So my calendar, the plugin, the Keynote speaker, the WordPress accessibility plugins that they've got going on there. My calendar is the plugin. So it's fully accessible. I've got it on all my websites. In fact, if you go to taylorstechtalks.com, which is my YouTube site, my podcast site, again, not trying to do self-promotion, but if you want to see how the plugin works, or you could go to the demo site, or, the American Council of the Blind convention, ACB Media website. My calendar is in action. And I love it because it's not only visually appealing, right? But it also is fully accessible because each event is a heading. And it's really awesome. And you can click on it, right? And they even have fields. Remember, he was talking about yesterday in the keynote. He, even has fields for, like, if it's audio described or braille, like, there's a whole bunch of accessibility fields in those event forms. And maybe WordCamp should use that plugin next year for their website, for their schedule page. Well, right. That's just kind of I don't even know where I was going with that. But that plugin is just so awesome. And you can also have it where people can subscribe to the calendar as well. So they can subscribe, because sometimes people want to just have a calendar, right? But they want to have it where it'll be added to their calendar application of choice. And so my calendar is the exclusive plugin that I use for all my websites that require a calendar.
That's very good information. It's very good to know. Other than yourself as a blind person expert, what other experts would you suggest someone seek out and work with in order to evaluate the websites that they're building and evaluating?
That is an awesome question. And again, I'm not, what I typically say is that WordPress website audits, or website audits in general, right? Let's just, take WordPress out of it for a second. They require a team. And Michael Doise, who is watching this YouTube stream on Discord with like a whole bunch of people at the moment, he is low vision, right? And so what I found, and actually this is going to be a future presentation I give at some kind of event, is accessibility auditing with a team, right? Because I'm totally blind. I can't see what contrast looks like. I don't know if there's colors that are mismatched, right? In terms of other experts beside the blindness field, though, it kind of depends on what you're doing, right? I would get somebody who, like, let's say you're doing a lot of media, right? So if like a caption specialist, I know that right now, I'm just going to admit this freely. My content is not fully accessible. I'm just going to say that right now. Yes, I try, but I don't have captions. I admit it, right? But the point is that depending on what you're doing, you want to try to get the experts that will help you. So maybe you're, trying to make a website that's related to, I don't even know, but like you want to get users involved as well, right? And you want to get users with different disabilities, right? So blind, deaf, like mental, like cognitive, and other groups, right? You want to try to get as much representation when you're building sites as possible to get the widest array of user output.
Do you have any suggestion where people may find these particular experts and users?
I do. So what I would recommend is, depending on what you're looking for, right? If you would like to find, for example, blind, let's just start with users first, right? Because those are the easiest to find, right? Users are easier to find. I don't want to say than experts, right? But there's a lot more of them who are like, screen reader users and whatnot. But you also want to get users with different abilities, right? Because, like, for example, I'm a very advanced screen reader user, right? So I may think something, it's just accessible, but somebody who maybe has just never used a screen reader or is very at beginner level be like, Taylor, this is fully inaccessible. So getting a wide range of users who have different abilities. But what I would say is seek out the organizations or, where people with disabilities tend to, quote unquote, hang out, or where they meet, right? So if you're going with the blindness space, there's a few different organizations. Well, there's like a ton of them. I know Amber, like it's the Texas School for the Blind. There's AFB, NFB, so National Federation of the Blind, ACB, American Council of the Blind. There's so many different organizations, and that's true, with many other disabilities, right? Or if somebody, or there's like groups or there's meetups. I think that they're going to be pretty easy to find, right? Or like I said, there's definitely a lot of us out there. It's just trying to go where we hang out, right? Where we may meet, and where we may talk about things, and then you can kind of get user input that way. Conventions are definitely a great way, right? When the blindness organizations have their conventions, a lot of people will set up exhibit booths and they'll get user feedback that way. There's definitely a lot of ways, but in terms of outside of the blindness community, as I am not as familiar with the other disabilities, what I would say is, again, use the same principles, right? Find some organization in that other field, right? In that other disability group who may be able to assist you. You kind of use those same techniques, but I can't really name any others, right? Because I'm not part of those communities for disability.
Great points that you've made. That's very important. There's automated tools that people use to test websites. Do you have any automated tool that you think is better than others that you might not necessarily recommend, but nevertheless, it's better than nothing?
All right. So automated tools. Again, we're going to open up a whole nother thing here because.
Okie doke.
Automated tools, again, people think, automated tools, they can produce accessible reports. But do you know how many automated tools don't have accessible reports for people who are blind to actually, or, disabilities to actually parse? Do you know how many inaccessible PDF images I've found of accessibility reports from an automated tool? I mean, come on. So what I would say is I typically use one of two things, and I use one more than the other. I typically use Wave. I really love Wave, and I also do use the DQ tool from time to time. It is pretty accessible, but I don't know. I really love Wave just because, I can only do like one page at a time per se, right? But typically, when I'm doing my audits, right, I will go page by page, or I'll take a random sampling. And what I do is I use the automated tools as a supplement, right? Because sometimes they get false positives again, right? They're like, oh, the contrast isn't great. So you know what I do? I go to my teammate, Michael, be like, okay, Michael, Wave says that this contrast isn't right. You have low vision. Is the contrast correct? He's like, oh, well, somebody with low vision with magnifiers are actually able to see it. So that's another thing you have to watch out for is false positives, right? Or false, like falsities in general, right? So what I would say typically is I use between Wave and I also use the Axe DQ tool, but primarily I use Wave.
Okay, we've heard that
Amber's
mentioned.
plugin as well.
And we've heard that mentioned today by others as well. So great. Thank you for that feedback. Circling back a little bit to the H tags and the heading tags, how does it affect your ability to use a website if somebody uses those H tags surely for font sizing rather not layout?
Mm-hmm. So you know what that does? Well, let me just, okay. Basically what this does is it, for example, if I use my H key, so H on the browser, right? If I'm in my screen reader, it will move between headings. So if there are headings for each line, right, it will literally say H, it would literally read the next line. And then the whole point of that key, right, the whole point of the heading command is basically gone now because everything on the page is a heading, right? So basically makes our navigation lives a lot harder because we can't skip to important sections, which headings are supposed to be used for. Do not use headings for bolding text. Don't do it, because users are going to have a lot harder time finding your stuff, and they'll probably want to leave your website faster than you can think that they would. So just don't do it. It makes our lives a lot harder, right? Because we're trying to deal with headings that maybe are not fully marked up, or even paragraphs that are acting as headings, or sometimes there's not any headings at all, which, well, is a little bit better than like headings for every line, but not by much, because then we have no place to navigate from, right? Because headings, what they'll do is they will skip to important sections of the page. It's almost like an outline. That's how they should be used, right? And then we can also use our H key, but we can also use our insert with your screen reader, right? You can go skip by headings, and you can do first letter navigation to try to find the heading you want, right? You just type a letter in the dialog for the headings, and it will bring up, the heading that starts with like that letter, for example. So there's a lot of ways to navigate, right? But if there's headings for every line, or there's no headings at all, that just is not helpful.
Very important points, and I appreciate that clarity. Now let's circle back for a minute on images. You mentioned early on images needing alt description so that your screen reader can identify that for you. What about an image carousel? Do you have issues with that?
All right. Well, image carousels are fun. I had to deal with one of these the other day. And there's a few common problems that I have. And again, this is exactly why I left my presentation so short, because I knew that there was going to be a lot of questions, right? So, carousels are fun. And here are the common problems that I find. Number one is that the carousels aren't even labeled, so there's no alt text at all. That's just a shame, and that's not helpful. Or the other problem I find is that the images, again, don't have alt text, but maybe the sliders are, labeled, right? It'll say previous, next. Or it will say like 1, 2, 3, 4, and be like, wait, what is that for? Just kind of reads it out in a weird manner. The other problem I see is when everything has aria, and literally what will happen is it will literally read out every like 5 seconds if a slideshow changes, right? And then it will lose your focus, right? So it'll lose your focus, and then it will bring you back to where it's reading. That kind of makes any sense. It's called like an aria live region. And so carousels are a tricky thing to deal with. I have found a couple plugins, again, that are easier to use. Soliloquy is one of them, but I would be careful on what sites you use it for, because it has that little aria problem from time to time. Again, it's not great, but I have had to use it when I have no other options. The only other option that I have is there's a carousel. I don't think it's a WordPress plugin, but it probably should be. It is by the company of Accessible 360. They made an accessible carousel. I believe it's like a JavaScript library or something. It's on GitHub. I will try to find the link to it. But basically it will allow you to create accessible carousels. That way it's just I think it's a JavaScript package. And then obviously, those carousels are fully accessible, right? With alt text and everything. But if you can avoid carousels in trying to make your site still look visually appealing, that just might be your best option if you're trying to, get it done in an accessible manner. But if you have to use it, those are some of your options.
Good options and good to know. So as we come to the end of this segment, Taylor, is there any closing comments or suggestions that you have for our listeners?
Yes. So there's a lot of different things that I would recommend if you're unsure, right, of, plugin accessibility, or if you're a plugin developer who's like, is my plugin accessible? Maybe I need to get that checked out. Just get an accessibility audit. And, then you are aware of the issues, right? Because accessibility audits can come in different forms, right? Get an accessibility audit. And then basically what's nice is that, some of us that are developers, right, we can actually literally be able to understand your code. So we can literally tell you what to do, right? So if you would like to be able to do that, that's definitely something that I would recommend, is get an accessibility audit from either, a company like mine or, any of these other great companies around here, right? And then from there, if you get an accessibility audit, then it's really time to try to remediate and try to fix your issues. And that is where it can be a little bit more difficult. But what I would say is have users in the process and have accessibility professionals. I'd have both if you can, but have everybody in the process that has, as many people as you can realistically, to make sure that your plugin is accessible, especially if it is an accessibility related plugin. But even if it's not, what I would say is, get that thing checked. And then what I would also recommend is ensuring that, even your plugin produces accessible front-end output. And I will be in the Zoom room as well, answering other questions and just talking with people as well. So I will be in the Zoom room if that's where other people want to ask more questions or, dive deeper into the topics.
Awesome information, Taylor. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I've seen a lot of engagement in the chat. People have really appreciated all the information you've shared. And I want to thank you, all the attendees, for attending this session with Taylor Arndt and myself. You can continue the conversation in the Zoom room. As she mentioned, you can continue to make comments in the chat. We're going to be taking a lunch break now, but please come back at 1 o'clock for the next talk, Platinum Accessibility, our responsibility to make sure the tools we create enable accessibility with Samuel, here on the same channel. See you after the break.